Hi, my name is Larry Lindner and I'm the coordinator of Boston's Literary District. We are actually the first official literary district in the United States. And we're very happy and proud to be putting on this literary lunch break series at South Station. Michael Blanding is our 7th speaker. His book just last week was named a Mass Book Must Read by the Massachusetts Center for the Book. That's a really rare award. It's hard to come by.
I have to say this is definitely the strangest place that I've had a book reading so far, and that's saying a lot. But at least I've got a captive audience for those of you who are waiting for a train, so hopefully you won't be disappointed. I'm just going to read a few pages from the beginning of the book. This starts right from chapter 1, so you don't need to know anything going into it. And then I'll talk for a little bit about the book and some of the maps that are in it, and some of the details of the crime, and some of the details about how I wrote it. And then if folks have any questions, I'm happy to take questions from people as well. E. Forbes Smiley III couldn't stop coughing. No matter how much he tried to suppress it, the tickle in the back of his throat kept breaking out into a hacking cough, drawing glances from the patrons sitting around him. The glass fishbowl of a reading room at the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University was quiet, except for the low hum of the air conditioning and the clicking of fingers on keyboards, making Smiley painfully aware of the noise he was making. At one point, he pulled a handkerchief out of his pocket to muffle the sound. As he did, an X-Acto knife blade wrapped inside fell softly onto the carpeted floor. He folded the cloth and put it back in his pocket, oblivious to what had just happened. Smiley was in the Beinecke this morning to study some rare atlases in preparation for the London Map Fair, an annual gathering of hundreds of map collectors who came to the British capital to buy, sell, and trade antiquarian maps. When people thought of Forbes Smiley, as he was universally known by friends, dealers, librarians, and clients, a few words inevitably sprang to mind: gregarious, jolly, larger than life. He spoke with the resonance of an Italian tenor, mangled by a nasally waspish affectation. His voice, like Daisy Buchanan's, was full of money. When he made phone calls, he made sure to announce he was calling from the vineyard. His upper crust affectations, however, were tempered by a charming self-deprecation. He'd ingratiated himself with many a librarian by inquiring after her spouse or children, and reciprocated with entertaining stories of travels around the world, or the progress of the new home he was building on Martha's Vineyard. Most of all, people thought of his laugh. For years, friends had reveled in Smiley's laugh, which rolled up out of his belly and racked his body in a cackle that only increased in volume the longer it went on. It was the kind of laugh that in college had earned him free tickets from theater producers, who sat him in the front row to egg on the audience. And it generally caused people to excuse the pretension that crept into his voice when he was expounding on any of his obsessions: architecture, New England history, the blues, and of course, maps. Whether they liked him or not, his colleagues and rivals in the map business had all been seduced by his knowledge. No, thank you. Which in certain areas exceeded that of anyone else in the world. On the morning of June 8, 2005, however, none of the librarians at the Beinecke's Public Services desk recognized him. Had they known him, they would have been shocked at the transformation he'd undergone. In addition to the cough that had developed overnight, he was suffering from a splitting headache left over from a night of drinking. Smiley had been drinking a lot these days. It was the only thing that took his thoughts away from the problems that multiplied in his mind whenever he was sober. As gifted as he was at remembering details about the maps, he was abysmal at managing the details of the business through which he earned his livelihood. No matter how entertaining his stories, the truth was he was overextended and hemorrhaging money. As studious as he looked, he was feeling a fresh sense of desperation by the time he left to get lunch around 11. Sitting in a coffee shop around the corner, he turned his options over in his mind. He could take the train to New York today and fly to London a day early in hopes of putting together a deal before the map fair began. Or he could abandon the whole plan and head back to the vineyard, saving the expense and hoping to find another way out of his financial mess. While he sat pondering his predicament without reaching a conclusion, the situation in the reading room had changed radically in his absence. Smiley may have missed the X-Acto knife blade that fell from his pocket, but a librarian named Naomi Sato had not. The Beinecke's librarians make regular sweeps of the room to ensure materials are handled properly and to subtly alert patrons they are being watched. As Sato had entered to make her check, she immediately spied the blade on the floor. Few objects can be more disturbing to someone who works in a building full of rare books than a tool that can separate the pages of a book from its binding. Saito picked up the blade and a tissue and walked back out of the room. Thank you. So that's just a little bit of a flavor of how I begin my book, The Map Thief, and gives you a little bit of flavor for this strange character, the Map Thief, E. Forbes Smiley III, whose name I just cannot say enough, who's at the center of this strange tale. Even though this was the beginning of my book, this was the end of the road for Smiley. On this day, as soon as the librarian found that X-Acto knife blade on the floor, they started looking into who was in the reading room, and they very quickly focused on Smiley as the most likely candidate for who would have dropped that blade. They followed him out of the library. A plainclothes police officer approached him on the street and asked him if perhaps he had taken a few things from the library because they were missing a few things. He came back to the library with them. They looked at his briefcase and they found half a dozen rare maps. These are maps that are worth upwards of tens of thousands of dollars, even hundreds of thousands of dollars. The thing about maps, though, is that there isn't just one copy of a particular map. So these maps are printed in multiple copies that are all considered originals. And so they didn't know immediately whether these maps were ones that Smiley had brought with him or whether they were ones that he had taken from the library. And as he was standing there, they saw him sort of fidgeting with his blazer pocket. And they asked him if he would please take out what was in it. And when he did, he took out this. I don't know if you could all see this from where you are. I could pass it around as well. This is a map of New England by John Smith that was originally done in 1616. This is a copy of the map that was done in 1631. And one of the librarians who was there recognized the handwriting. There's some handwriting in pen at the bottom of this map that she recognized as belonging to one of the Beinecke's patrons. And she immediately cried, "That's our map!" And Smiley was arrested on the spot and spent the night in jail. I just want to pause for a second and just tell you a little bit about this map because it helps to understand what makes these maps so valuable and why people are willing to pay as much money as they are for them. So as I said, this map was done originally in 1616. John Smith, many of you may know from his role in the Virginia colony and his purported love affair with Pocahontas, which probably never happened. But he had sort of a second chapter in his life. After John Smith was sort of drummed out of the Virginia colony, he started exploring a territory that was north of Virginia that was then just known as North Virginia. And he thought that it needed a snappier name, and in order to claim it for his home territory, he coined the name New England, and he drew this map. And this was actually the first accurate map of the New England coastline. So just a couple interesting things about this map. First, you'll notice that there's an enormous portrait. Thanks. There's an enormous portrait of John Smith in the corner, which he put there so to claim this area not only for England, but also for himself. And he was vain enough that he actually changed this portrait over time as he got older. So this is a later version of the map, and his beard is bushier and his jacket is more elaborately decorated. Second interesting thing about this map is that all along the coastline here, you can see these names of these English cities and towns. And those were ones that John Smith actually put those there himself. This was in 1616, 4 years before the Pilgrims ever landed. And all of these were Native American settlements that he actually changed the names to these English cities and towns. This is sort of unprecedented act of virtual colonization before a single English settler had ever set foot in the land. And most of these names didn't survive, or at least didn't survive in the places he put them. But one of them, right down here, you can see where he wrote the name Plymouth. And that's actually where the Pilgrims landed, and they had a copy of this map in hand, and they actually took that name for the name of their own colony. So even though John Smith wasn't able to come and settle this area, he did play a role in the founding and the future history of New England. I'm just going to pass this around if folks want to look at it in a little bit more detail. And I go into all that detail because it just shows you, how important these documents were. As I was researching this book, I'd always been a map lover, but I hadn't realized the role that a lot of these maps had played in history. They play roles in trade and conquest and boundary disputes between countries, and really did change the course of nations. And because of that, there is a really interesting some might say, quirky subculture of people who really prize these objects and are willing to pay a lot of money for them. And Smiley was a person who catered to these map collectors. He had grown up in New Hampshire, even despite his name, E. Forbes Smiley III, which sounds like he comes from aristocracy or old New England money. He actually grew up middle class in New Hampshire, but he was always really fascinated by history. And from a very early age, he wanted to learn everything he could, and he was always known as sort of the smartest person in the room among his friends in high school and college, and had this sort of automatic recall of facts. And so after college, he gravitated to New York, and he sort of fell almost by accident into the rare map trade. And he really found this area where he could excel. This is a world in which a single line on a piece of paper can mean the difference of thousands of dollars if you've got one edition of a map versus another edition of a map. He would do original scholarship about which explorers were copying maps from other explorers. And he did really well in this world, and he made a lot of money initially. He started in the 1980s. But, and he actually helped to put together some amazing collections of maps, including the Leventhal map collection, which many of you may have seen in the Boston Harbor Hotel. If you go there, you see all these rare maps on the walls. Those were collected by Norm Leventhal, a real estate developer in Boston, who just passed away a couple of months ago. And he was one of Smiley's best clients, and Smiley actually helped gather together all of those maps. And the collection was actually donated to the Boston Public Library and now forms the basis of the Leventhal Map Center at the Boston Public Library. So he had, as a legitimate dealer, he had a huge influence on the community and on the field. The problem with Smiley is that he was a terrible business person. And right from the very beginning, he didn't know how to manage money. He would obtain one map, and almost before he'd sell it, he'd immediately be going on to the next map. And over the years, he started falling into debt. And as maps became more and more valuable through the 1990s, all of a sudden, the price of art was really unattainable for even fairly wealthy people, doctors, lawyers, Wall Street executives. And so maps became this new kind of area where people were collecting and buying objects to hang on their walls. And so they started paying a lot of money for them. And new map dealers started entering into the business. And you think of map collecting probably as this kind of rarefied air of men with white hair and blue blazers and back rooms of libraries. And it is that, but it's also a very cutthroat business. And Smiley was just unable to compete against these other dealers that were really aggressive. They'd go into auctions and they would undercut each other, and they would force each other, their rivals, to pay too much. And so again, he began falling further and further behind in debt. And started actually nursing sort of these resentments against some of these other dealers, and even against some of the libraries that he felt didn't treat him fairly. And so as he told me, he was in a library one day and looking down at the map in front of him and realizing that he could fold it down to the size of a credit card, slip it into his pocket, sell it for the next day for $30,000 to somebody that he already knew would buy it. And that was the beginning of this slippery slope, that he sort of did that, I think, out of an act of desperation, out of an act of trying to just get out of, the immediate debt that he was in that day. But after that, there was just no looking back. He started accelerating the pace of his thefts over the next 5 years, and started hitting libraries all over the country and even all over the world, stealing these priceless objects and tearing them out of books. When Smiley was arrested that day in June of 2005, the FBI agent who started investigating the case, and just to decide, this FBI agent is not your picture of the G-man with the sunglasses. He was an ex-Rhode Island cop from East Providence, had just started in the FBI. He was much more, his past experience had been in cocaine busts. And all of a sudden, this case falls on his table and says, somebody stole these expensive pieces of paper from libraries. Go check it out. So he didn't know anything about maps, but he did know about thieves. And the thing that he knew about thieves is that when they're caught, it's usually not the first time that they've committed a crime. And so he started calling around to libraries and rare book departments of universities all over the country, and he asked them two questions. Has Forbes Smiley been in your collection lately? And are you missing any maps? And 6 institutions answered yes to both of those questions. In addition to Yale, Harvard, the Boston Public Library, the New York Public Library, the Newberry Library in Chicago, and the British Library in London. And just as an aside, I have to say, many of you, I'm sure, has been following the news of the last month at the Boston Public Library of those prints that went missing, and thankfully that they were recovered. I have been accused of possibly taking those prints in order to publicize my book. I have to say that those rumors are false. I deny them completely. But just goes to show you that this kind of thing can still go on, that there is issues of library security and library cataloging even today. Even though those prints were thankfully found, the type of cataloging and the lack of cataloging in some cases still makes these things vulnerable. So it still makes this a timely story. So Smiley is now faced with these thefts of stealing from these institutions all over the country. And he immediately, very quickly, decides that he's going to cooperate. And he goes to the authorities. He says, I'm going to help you recover all of the maps that I stole. And at the end of the day, he admits to stealing 97 maps worth over $3 million. The FBI still had this treasure hunt on their hands, however. They had to go and they had to find where these maps were taken from, who they were sold to, and then how they could get them back to the institutions. And that took the better part of 2 years to track them down. In addition, as Larry mentioned in my introduction, there's serious questions about whether Smiley revealed the whole extent of his crimes. Even though he admitted stealing almost 100 maps, the libraries that he stole from are missing upwards of 250 maps. And many of them accuse him of stealing some of those maps as well. In my investigation, I looked into a lot of the rumors and the evidence, and I was able to trace at least a dozen maps that they claim that he stole that he didn't admit stealing, and there may be more, but the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Unfortunately, however, that mystery or the doubt about that goes to a fundamental issue about how these rare, priceless objects are held and cataloged by the libraries. As I said, looking at the example of the Boston Public Library, a lot of times these things were in books, they were in folders with a whole bunch of other maps, and sometimes the libraries didn't even know what they had. So it wasn't until Smiley was caught that the libraries even knew a lot of these maps were missing. And in some cases, Smiley would actually go to the libraries, and along with the map, he would take the card catalog card so that they had no record that they had even had these objects. And then he was able to go and buy and sell them in broad daylight because there are more than one copy of each of these objects. It wasn't like with the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum where if somebody takes that Rembrandt from the wall, there's no way they can possibly sell it because everybody knows that that belongs on the wall of the Gardner Museum. Even though some of these are rare and there might be 10 copies or 12 copies, there's always the chance that a 13th copy could emerge. And Smiley said that he was selling off a collection of an old dealer, and so he was able to get away with this, and it was really the perfect crime for many years until he was caught. And had it not been for that dropping that razor blade, he may not have been caught at all. I just want to close with one more story from my book, which in some ways is the most unusual aspect of this tale. It was one of the things that convinced me that I had to write this book. And it's what Smiley did with the money. So as I said, he stole more than $3 million worth of rare maps. And a lot of the money he spent on the kind of things you'd expect someone to spend it on. He spent it on plane tickets to Europe and fancy clothes and treating people to dinner at nice restaurants. But at least $1 million worth of the money went into this really kind of strange, quixotic project that he had of buying this town up in Maine and kind of remaking it into his image of the perfect New England town that he remembered from his childhood. And he started small with a farmhouse that he renovated, and then he started buying the post office, the general store, a restaurant, and really started kind of remaking this town. He employed half the people in the town who sort of looked at them as this Robin Hood figure come in to save their fortunes. Unfortunately, though, if you know anything about northern Maine, the worst thing you can do is tell other people what to do with their property up there. And half of the town really hated him and really looked at him as this kind of interloper, this kind of flatlander from New York come in to tell them what to do with their land. And so he ended up getting in this huge legal dispute with people in town. And it turned into this court battle. He ended up hemorrhaging even more money. And in the last 6 months of that court battle, he dramatically increased his thefts and he started targeting new institutions, including the Beinecke, and it was that led to him dropping that razor blade and eventually getting arrested. So in closing, as I said, Smiley admitted to stealing almost 100 maps worth $3 million. It's very likely he stole more. He did spend time in prison, about 3 years in prison. And many of the libraries he stole from believe that he should have spent more. He got out in 2011 and went back to the Vineyard where he lives today, where I interviewed him. And he has nothing to do with rare maps anymore, but he did start a new career working as a landscaper for $12 an hour. So, you can see sort of how his fortunes have changed since then. So thank you all so much for listening to me talk a little bit about my book, and if anybody has any questions, I'd love to answer them. So the question is about John Smith and about a monument to John Smith up in Cape Ann, right in Rockport, in Gloucester. I'm wondering if John Smith had anything to do with Cape Ann. In fact, he did name Cape Ann. As I said, most of the names on this map didn't survive, but Anne was one of the ones that did, and it was actually named, I believe, after the king's mother. It was King Charles, and I believe his mother was Anne, and it was named after her, and it stuck to this day. The question is about the actual charges that were against Smiley. It was a federal crime. I won't go into all the details of the law, but there was a law that had just been passed called theft of an object of cultural heritage. And if you steal something worth over $100,000 from a museum or library, you can get charged with a federal crime that I think carries a maximum of 20 years or something like that. So that is what he was charged with. That is what actually convinced him to come forward and cooperate with authorities. So the question is about how these maps were printed and were they drawn by hand. So the way it works, I learned a lot about this. I won't bore you with all the details again, but so the way these maps were made was they were drawn on a manuscript. So somebody would actually draw them by hand on a piece of paper. And then they were taken and etched into copper. And they were engraved into copper, and then they were printed on a printing press. And one copper plate could handle about 1,000 copies of a map. And so, for each of these editions, say that John Smith map, there may have been 1,000 copies back in 1631, but most of them have been lost or destroyed over the years, and so maybe 25 exist today. But those are all considered originals because they were all from that original printing, and they're all treated by collectors as originals. The question is about the role that maps play in real estate transactions and the time of John Smith. I don't know necessarily. The maps that I was looking at primarily were regional maps, so they were things that were looking at like borders between countries. So you'd have an English map and a French map in the same area, and they would draw the border in different places. And in some ways, sometimes those actually led to wars. I know there are people who specialize in collecting those kind of more street-level real estate maps, though, and they're very important. I know one of the very first maps, one of the oldest maps that survives, is a map from ancient Egypt. It's from several thousand BC. And it was actually a map that determined the borderlines of an estate of some landowner versus another landowner. So, from earliest times, these things have mattered in terms of real estate transactions. The question is, what is the future of maps given modern technology? And do maps have a future, perhaps? I thought a lot about this because I'm a map lover and because I wrote this book about maps. And when you think about it, you realize that people always decry sort of the death of the map, that people aren't using maps anymore. But really, we're using maps more than ever. We're just carrying them around with us in our pocket. And many of you probably pulled out your phone and used a map to get to the station today. I know I did. In terms of paper maps, though, I do think that it's a tragedy if people do stop using paper maps because it's a very different experience to look at a blinking triangle and where you're at the center of the universe and everything kind of swirls around you versus laying out a map on a table and understanding exactly how things go together. So I know I still use maps when I travel. I hope that other people do too, and I hope that they never completely, I hope that they do have a future. The question is, how old was he when he started to steal? When he started, there's some question about exactly when he started, but when he was caught, he was 49. And when he started, he's probably stealing for about 5 years, something like that, so probably in his mid-40s. So he's, this was about 10 years ago, so he's about 60 now, so he still, could very well have another chapter in his life. Hopefully a legitimate one. Do maps have a legal standing? I do think that maps have a legal standing in some cases. I know with a lot of property maps, for example, they're often appended to a deed or things like that. But no, I think that the value of maps has much more to do with the kind of story that they tell. When you have a map that kind of delineates a certain boundary for an area or location, I think it's telling you a story about that location. It's kind of implanting that image in your mind, the same way that John Smith implanted in the minds of anybody who looked at his map that this was English territory, and indeed it became English territory. I think that maps are much more valuable for that than for any legal ramifications they may have. Do I think he would have gone away with it had he thrown his weapon in a trash can? He may have gotten away with it that day, but I think it was just a matter of time before he got caught. I mean, he was very good at what he did, but I don't think he was good enough to evade capture forever. As I said, he was really in a bad state towards the end. He was drinking a lot. He was really desperate, and I think it was only a matter of time before he made a mistake. Great, well, thank you all so much for coming, and hope you all catch your train on time for those of you catching a train, and thanks again for listening to me.
She started screaming then, calling them every name in the book, shouting, TDC, TDC, threat, duress, and coercion, over and over again, even as the female forced open the door and took hold of her by the left arm, and Kucha, good dog, faithful dog, went right at her.